Okay, here we go. Now for part two of our lecture on coloniality and gender. Uh, I you Part one was pretty much a course overview and discussion of the syllabus, so that's ready for you. So you can just look at that if you want to go back to that. But now we're going to discuss the coloniality of gender. Okay, so for this week's readings, I asked you to read Maria Lugones' essay. Before we get to that, let's kind of do a quick review. So, from the Ashcroft reading, we have this kind of working definition of decolonization, which is the process of revealing and dismantling colonialist power in all its forms. This includes dismantling the hidden aspects of those institutional and cultural forces that had maintained the colonialist power that remain, even after political independence is achieved. So, last week we talked about particular institutions that maintain colonial power, such as like the university. But now I want to talk specifically about the kind of one of the cultural forces or ways of thinking about how colonialism, and we'll talk about coloniality, creates sort of systems of knowledge, systems of categorization that are used to reinforce its power. Or the power of the colonizer, and also to kind of structure the systems that are in place. So a big part of why it's important to decolonize still, Ashcroft and others say, is that the globalization of the modern world economy has meant that political independence has not affected the kinds of changes in economic and cultural control that the early nationalists might have expected. It has even been argued by some recent commentators that the colonial powers deliberately avoided granting independence until they had, through internal discriminations and hegemonic educational practices, created an elite comprador class to maintain aspects of colonial control on their behalf, but without the cost or the opprobrium associated with the classic colonial models. So they argue that decolonization still happens because you have these systems of power that are still in place, especially through the kind of development of a comprador class. So that's like me, and many of you, okay, who maintain aspects of colonial control on behalf of the kind of what you could call the European and American colonial powers. Okay, so in order to decolonize that, you have to understand the kind of I guess. Well, let's just stick with this word, systems of power. I know that's kind of vague, okay, but I'll kind of get into that. And how they maintain colonial control, right? So, one of the kind of specific ways that this system of control is generated and maintained is through what Maria Lugones calls the modern colonial gender system, okay? So, the argument that Lugones makes is that gender, and not just race, and we'll get into why it's not just race, but obviously race is very, very important. But gender and race, let's just stick with gender right now. Gender is a knowledge system that is instituted to enable colonialism. Okay? So she argues in the essay I asked you to read that colonialism did not impose pre-colonial European gender arrangements on the colonized. It imposed a new gender system that created very different arrangements for colonized males and females than for white bourgeois colonizers. Thus, it introduced many genders and gender itself as a colonial concept and mode of organization of relations of production, property relations, of cosmologies, and ways of knowing. Okay, so this is quite a radical idea. The idea that gender itself is not something that was well, I don't know about if I want to use the word present, but it wasn't a way of organizing people before European colonialism, especially in the argument Lugones makes is in these kind of pre-colonial places and people. At the same time, this new gender arrangements were not the ones that Europeans themselves lived up to or held for themselves, but were ones that were created in order to institute colonialism, in order to kind of emphasize it. Right. What one way to think about this is, let's say instead of we're talking about gender, let's say we're talking about like religion or something like that, or capitalism or systems of law. Right. These are all things that were also instituted by colonialism. Right. You have these kind of indigenous people who get conquered, and I can tell you from the case of the United States where, these kind of colonizing groups come in and say, hey, sign this contract and this land now belongs to me. And, this is the kind of general way it's taught, right, in U.S. high schools, right? But then, many of these indigenous people say, well, yeah, we'll sign this contract, but what does it mean to own land? This is not even a sort of understanding or a kind of a system that they kind of follow, right? That the idea that land can be owned in some sort of way, right? Similarly, then Lugones is saying that gender or these kind of special gender arrangements themselves are also a system that is implemented and forced upon the indigenous as a way to implement colonial control. Okay, and what's important to note, she's saying, is that it's different arrangements for colonized males and females than for white bourgeois colonizers. So this gender system is not the same gender system that they had in Europe, or, let's just stick with Europe, okay? The gender system is one that was used in order to emphasize and institute colonial control, all right? So that's the kind of basic concept. Now, how does she get to this idea of the coloniality of gender, okay? So she starts with a practical problem, right? Why do men of color, and what she means by men of color is basically non-white or non-Anglo-European or, men feel indifferent to the injustices faced by women of color, okay? So basically, why is it that there's sort of a sexism even within, let's say, colonized or people of color communities, okay? And this is a kind of a long-standing thing that, if you want to, we could talk more about in the forums or something like that. Okay. So Lugones looks at a couple frameworks, okay, for thinking about this new concept of the coloniality of gender. The first framework she talks about, and these frameworks are used to address issues of racist, sexist, capitalist, and colonial oppression. Okay, the first is the concept of intersectionality, which was first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, but used by many feminine women of color, or I don't know. You want to use the word third wave? I don't know. Women of color feminists. Okay, especially in the legal system, and I'm going to talk more about that later. But already you should know quite a bit about intersectionality if you've taken other gender studies courses before. Okay, and Lugones says that it's adequate in revealing how power works, but insufficient for oppressed men to acknowledge their complicity or collaboration in the violent domination of women of color. And this, I think, is a really important point. It's that when you think about intersectionality, oftentimes people think about it as like, oh, you have this compounding of oppression, but no one talks about intersectionality in terms of, you can benefit in one way, but then also be, negatively influenced in another. So intersectionality, even though it doesn't necessarily imply that you can't be both privileged and oppressed by the system, many times it's only considered in that way. Okay? All right, so sorry if you can hear my screaming baby. I hope that's okay. All right, so another framework that Lugones uses is the coloniality of power by Aníbal Quijano. And Quijano argues that coloniality of power, which is, and I'm going to go into depth on the coloniality of power, but is a system that's used to justify and institute and incorporate colonialism. And it reveals how power channels through knowledge systems inherited from colonialism. At the same time, though, and specifically talks about race, and race as a sort of system of knowledge that's used to justify kind of these separations that make the system work. Okay? But the problem with the coloniality of power is that it does not specifically articulate the role of gender in that system of categorization. It's almost like gender is a kind of secondary, or if even kind of, and I think this is a pretty devastating critique that Lugones makes, is that gender is considered to be normative, and instead of something that's also part of the coloniality of power. Okay, and that's the big kind of gripe. I don't know if gripe is the right word. The big critique that Lugones makes, and kind of her very important intervention. All right, so let's keep going. I'm trying to get these videos to be shorter, so I feel like I talk too long. All right, so then Lugones' research goal then is to demonstrate how solidarity, right, whether that's between people of color right? Or between all women gets disrupted because of these unacknowledged power dynamics of the modern colonial gender system. Okay, so it's like, if like a like a probably second wave or whatever, someone says, women of the world unite, or someone's, or like a social, universal, what would be, global socialist says, workers of the world unite. Lugones would say it's like this solidarity gets disrupted because you don't acknowledge the power dynamics, of this modern colonial gender system. Not all women are the same, and not all workers are the same. So, and not all people of color are the same. Not all of the colonized, quote, wretched of the earth, that's a Fanon term, are the same. And if you think about it that way and ask for solidarity without acknowledging these power dynamics, then, it's going to get disrupted. Okay? All right. So explaining how that works is important. And that's Lugones' sort of research intervention. Okay, so let's start with Quijano's coloniality of power. So Quijano understands that all power is structured in relations of domination, exploitation, and conflict, as social actors fight over control over the four basic areas of existence: sex, labor, collective authority, and subjectivity intersubjectivity, their resources and products. Okay, so this is important, is that power is not something where it's like top down, okay, where it's like I have power, and I grant it to you, or, you take it from me. Power is a relationship. Okay. So power needs to be structured in relations of domination. So, in order for there to be strong, there must be weak. In order for there to be rich, there must be poor. Okay. And so it's like creating these kind of structures, in this relation of domination is how power works and exerts itself. So in order for the colonizer to be a colonizer, there must be a colonized. In order to colonize, you must have, indigenous to be colonizing. Okay, so what is characteristic of global Eurocentered capitalist power is that it is organized around two axes that Quijano terms the coloniality of power and modernity. The axes order the disputes over the control of each area of existence in such a way that the meaning and forms of domination in each area are thoroughly infused by the coloniality of power and modernity. Okay, so basically the system of relations in our world are structured by a power system that was instituted in order to enforce colonial control. And that system kind of organizes all the hierarchies that are in place today. So Quijano argues that specifically racial differences, let's go back to this, this is the key line right here. All of these relations are structured over control of what he calls the four basic areas of existence: sex, labor, collective authority, and subjectivity, intersubjectivity, their resources and products. Okay, so it's a very materialist way of thinking about, how relationships between people are structured. Okay, and Quijano argues that racial differences are instituted over competition over sexual access and its resources and products. So race is a category system based on pseudoscience, really. Okay, like, you have people in the 1400s creating these kind of terms, for, racial differences. To justify relations of superiority and inferiority. So if it's like, I was able to go into your house and take your things, then it must be because I'm more powerful. And I'm more powerful, because I'm, and then I would create some sort of system where I say it's like, I must be more powerful because I'm biologically different from you. And this is a lot of it, Quijano argues, was based on Eurocentric theories of social classes. And this was also kind of a long-standing kind of... if you read Quijano, and I haven't, but I've read some review of it, but basically he talks all about like how in Spain, you had these kind of incursions and religious differences between Catholics, Jews, and Moors. And these forms of social classification and these kind of rules about biological purity were then used to kind of organize the kingdom, and then kind of extend it into their colonies as well. So this form of social classification, basically the creation of race, right, permeates all social existence and generates new identities, right? So coloniality does not just refer to racial classification, it is an all-encompassing phenomenon. So these patterns of power are meant to justify colonizer superiority. And it defines the relations of our present era. Okay, so let's see, how much did I talk about this? Yeah. It's very similar to the argument that Said makes about Orientalism, where you kind of create this category of people in order to justify the kind of system of domination that's going on. And so race, instead of being something that we consider to be kind of inborn, it's actually something that's created in order to organize this competition over what Quijano's saying is sexual access, its resources and products. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so let's get into the critique then. Okay, so Lugones' critique of Quijano is that the lenses that Quijano uses assume patriarchal and heterosexual understandings of the disputes over control of sex, its resources, and products. Okay, so Quijano accepts the global Eurocentered capitalist understanding of what gender is about. So basically, Quijano sees race as constructed by colonialism, but assumes that this construction assumes that gender itself is normal and biological. And so control over sex, its resources, and products is kind of a normative thing that he thinks is kind of, or at least it seems like he's arguing is kind of natural. And race is created in order to organize the competition over things like sex, control of sex, and resources and products. So it assumes heteronormative patriarchal values as the norm, as opposed to a value system instituted by colonialism. So in this kind of system that Quijano is arguing, race is constructed, but gender isn't. Okay, whereas let's keep going. So the way he talks about is colonialism is structuring competition over resources between men. Okay, so Quijano appears to take it for granted that the disputes over control of sex is a dispute among men about men's control of resources who are thought to be female. Men do not seem understood as the resources in sexual encounters. Women are not thought to be disputing for control over sexual access. The differences are thought of in terms of how society reads reproductive biology. So it normalizes this kind of patriarchal heterosexuality. So race is still defined in terms of men, as men competing, and racial categorizations basically being this kind of, really kind of all racial categories being another word for dominant, strong and weak. Let's just use strong and weak, okay? And and the strong and weak compete over women, whereas this naturalizes a patriarchal heterosexuality. Okay, so it's really insufficient model for understanding gender construction. If Quijano's saying that coloniality structures all of our sort of let's say, kind of identity and systems of, knowledge and, relations of labor and, governmental organization, then it actually is insufficient for understanding this very, very important way of understanding gender. He says that gender is kind of a product of coloniality of power, but actually what Lugones is saying is that gender is actually a creation used to institute is an instrument of coloniality as well. So not just race, but gender as well. And we'll get into how that is, okay? So what Lugones is saying is what aspects of gender are shown depends on how gender is actually conceptualized in the model. In Quijano's model, gender seems to be contained within the organization of that basic area of existence that Quijano calls sex, its resources, and products. That is, there is an account of gender within the framework that is not itself placed under scrutiny, and that is too narrow and overly biologized, as it presupposes sexual dimorphism. So sexual dimorphism is this idea that there's just two sexes, male and female. Okay, heterosexuality, which is what we consider to be male-female kind of sex, I guess, and reproduction. Patriarchal distribution of power, which is that men are in charge, and so on. So Quijano seems to me to imply that gender difference is constituted in the disputes over control of sex, its resources, and products. Differences are shaped through the manner in which this control is organized. Sex, as he understands, as biological attributes that become elaborated as social categories. He contrasts the biological quality of sex with phenotype, which does not include differential biological attributes. The color of one's skin, the shape of one's eyes and hair do not have any relation to the biological structure. On the other hand, sex, on the other hand, seems unproblematically biological to Kano. So yeah, race is quite obviously not a biological category. Those of you who are interested, we can talk more about this in the forums. Just post, and I can look up some resources for you. But no, race is not. You cannot genetically identify a racial category. Okay, we'll put it like that. All right, there's no relation to biological structure. But Quijano stops there. Why not extend it into sex as well? All right, and that's part of the criticism. Okay. All right, so that's the insufficiency with Quijano's theory. Okay, so another theory that, but there are useful things about coloniality of power that Lugones wants to use. Okay, but by thinking about it in terms of intersectionality. So intersectionality is a term. Okay, just the term itself was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a legal scholar, who came upon these kind of issues when it came to issues of in the American legal system, where someone would sue for discrimination, right? And in the courts, they would be like, okay, well, you seem to suffer from sexual discrimination. But then the subject would be someone who not only is is a woman who faced sexual discrimination, but also is a person of color, right? Let's say they're African American or something like that. And so then the person suffers from dual oppressions, right? And these dual oppressions do not work in this it's additive, it's 1 + 1. But these oppressions work together and kind of form the subject and form the identity. But what is called a multitude of oppressions, okay? But at the same time, the court system did not have a way to address that. It would be well, which law is this person breaking? Are they breaking a rule against sexual discrimination, or are they breaking a rule against racial discrimination? Okay, so Crenshaw found it very useful and to use this term intersectionality to talk about how oppression happens in a multitude of ways, okay? So this is what Lugones says about intersectionality. Intersectionality reveals what is not seen when categories such as gender and race are conceptualized as separate from each other. The move to intersect the categories has been motivated by the difficulties in making visible those who are dominated and victimized in terms of both categories. Though everyone in capitalist Eurocentered modernity is both race and gender, not everyone is dominated or victimized in terms of them. Okay, so intersectionality makes visible, okay, as a concept, it makes visible the ways to see how people are dominated in multiple ways and victimized in multiple ways, okay? And even though everyone is race and gendered, not everyone is dominated or victimized in terms of race and gender, other I don't know, intersectional theorists, you could say, and I don't know if you want to be called this, but bell hooks, for example, would say that, it's not just that too, it's also capitalist exploitation. We're all subjectified is the term you could use, okay? We're all made into subjects by the knowledge system, okay? By the system of, values that are used to create knowledge and knowledge categories, okay? And this includes race, this includes gender, this includes class. This also includes ability, right? And so on and so forth. Language ability as well. Okay? So you have these intersections of disciplinary mechanisms. And it's important to be able to identify and understand how they kind of work together. Okay? And make visible. This is key, to make visible the ways that these things work. Okay? So a good working definition of intersectionality comes from Jennifer Nash's work. So Jennifer Nash is a very kind of more recent scholar on intersectionality, and she has a lot of discussions about it, about how it's been co-opted in certain ways, how in the end you still kind of can't get away from the fact that intersectionality really comes to be archetypally, defined by the Black woman's body, and how even that's problematic. Okay. So I recommend you read that if you're really interested in thinking about intersectionality, especially today. Okay, but the working definition is that the notion that subjectivity is constituted by mutually reinforcing vectors of race, gender, class, and sexuality. Okay, right. So of course sexuality too, right? So these mutually reinforcing vectors are what constitute subjectivity. So subjectivity is like, who are you? How do you define? How do you get defined? How do you understand yourself? What are you? Who are you as a subject? Okay, and that it's constituted by multiple things. Okay, and so you can't simplify it to just one thing. Like, I am a class. I am, for example, like saying like, oh, I am a settler colonial. That's not enough, right? There's mutually reinforcing vectors, right? Or, if I think of myself as Asian or Asian American, that's just one aspect. I'm also a gendered person. I'm also, I don't know, I'm also middle class, right? I'm also educated, right? So all of these mutually reinforce and lead to very, very different results. Okay, so this gets to what Lugones is talking about. It's like, how can you have these kinds of solidarity when people don't acknowledge these kind of differences? Okay, all right, so let's keep going. I mean, yeah, so this is part of the settler colonial argument, right? It's like, just because I'm a, quote, person of color doesn't mean that I can so easily pick up this term decolonization and say, oh yeah, I'm part of the decolonizing force, when not only am I a person of color, but I'm also, a settler colonial, right? Okay, so this is important to understand. And maybe some people might even say I'm not a person of color because, I'm Han. Well, I consider myself Taiwanese, but many people would say I'm Han Chinese or whatever. Okay, but anyway, let's go on. Okay, but intersectionality is very, very useful. Okay, this is Lugones again. It becomes logically clear that the logic of categorical work on these typos. Logic of categorical separation distorts what exists at the intersection, such as violence against women of color. Given the construction of the categories, the intersection misconstrues women of color. So once intersectionality shows us what is missing, we have ahead of us the task of reconceptualizing the logic of the intersection so as to avoid separability. It is only when we perceive gender and race as intermeshed or fused that we actually see women of color. Okay? So it's important to see race and gender as intermeshed or fused. Okay? That they kind of mutually reinforce each other. All right? So not only is your masculinity linked, not only are you masculine and raced, right? For example, not only am you an Asian male, let's use me as an example, right? I'm an Asian American male, right? Or man, I guess, and heterosexual cisgender. Okay, we can just keep going. But not only am I Asian American and male, or masculine, let's just say, my Asianness or Asian Americanness influences my masculinity, and my masculinity influences my Asian Americanness. So these are not separate categories, okay? They're fused together, right? So, so building upon using the term intersectionality, right, or thinking about, you could say thinking about the coloniality of power intersectionally. Okay, Lugones argues that gender itself is part of the coloniality of power. Okay, and she gives some examples. Okay, one of the examples she gives is that there is gender systems that prefigure biological sex. Okay, so she talks about examples of intersex people. Especially in tribal societies prior to colonization, that were not assimilated to a sexual binary. So, like today, I guess during the time of period of aggressive colonialism, anytime someone who was intersex was born, they were forced to be undergo surgery so that their biological traits would make them fixed into this clear gender kind of dimorphism. Okay. But not all traditions correct and normalize, quote unquote, intersex people, right? So it's not. So intersex people did not have to be assimilated before colonization. Okay. Another example that Lugones uses is how coloniality institutes patriarchy. So Lugones argues and gives examples from Oyeronke Oyewumi. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Study of the Yoruba people, who says that people were not necessarily organized into these patriarchal societies. Okay. And that actually these kind of differences were not considered to be the definition of what is leadership or not. And people were were recognized not as male or female, but they were assigned different kind of categories and then based upon anatomic parts. But these anatomic parts were not seen as was seen as a variety and not as a binary opposition. Okay, but then Oyewumi, okay, argues that the introduction of the Western gender system was accepted by Yoruba males, who thus colluded with the inferiorization of Ana females. So when we think of the indifference of non-white men to the violences exercised against non-white women, we begin to have some sense of the collaboration between Ana males and Western colonials against Ana females. So Oyewumi makes clear that both men and women resisted cultural changes at different levels. So Oyewumi's study demonstrates that when colonialism happened for the Yoruba people, many of the males began to collude and work with the colonizers because this new system actually privileged males over females when that is not something that existed before. So coloniality institutes a patriarchal system that is dependent upon a clear and categorical separation between the sexes. And then what happens then is like a sort of the males become more powerful in that kind of small group, but then diminishing the power overall of the kind of colonized groups. So colonized men basically, in some cases, okay, Oyewumi cites, colonized men work together with colonizing European men to undermine local women. All right. And yes, they weren't called men and women, right? But then colonization incentivized this categorical separation. Okay. And then another example that Lugones gives is Paula Gunn Allen's work on the indigenous Native Americans, tribes that were kind of gynocratic. I think that I've never heard that term before, but I think it's quite interesting. So a gynocratic egalitarianism. So, there was actually a lot of the kind of American Indian tribes thought that the primary potency in the universe was female, and that understanding authorizes all tribal activities. So they're kind of, I don't know if they're gynocracies, but this idea that women can be like the leaders, right? Let's see. But then at the same time, in order to dominate and transform tribal life, the colonizers need to institute a new system which diminishes the gynocracy, okay? So the primacy of the female as creator is displaced and replaced by male gendered creators, generally generic or Christian, right? So, in order for the colonialism to work, then you say, your gods, like and your god, if your god is a woman, then that's wrong. So, or sexed or gendered as female, then it's wrong. And you need to have a male kind of gendered creator, for that life. And then these kind of governing institutions and philosophies, their foundations are destroyed. People are pushed off their land so that they're kind of, and because they're pushed off their land and their way of life, then they become dependent upon the colonizers for their survival. So they can't use their former systems. The system requires this kind of male dominance. So it's like if you want to go, let's say your tribe is on the ropes, and you need, you need the colonizers to kind of give you back land or to give you some sort of resources. They won't negotiate with the women leaders of your tribe, right? And so you have to have men go negotiate with them. And then the clan structure gets replaced by the nuclear family. So the women clan heads are replaced by elected male officials, and the psychic net that is formed and maintained by the nature of non-authoritarian gynocentricity, grounded in respect for diversity of gods and peoples, is thoroughly rent. Okay, so rent can also mean like destroyed. Okay, so a system of life where you have women leaders gets kind of destroyed in order to institute colonialism. Okay, and this is important, right? Colonialism creates gender categories. So colonizers, okay, in order to kind of institute rule and create kind of systems where the bounties and the resources of the colonies are diverted and sent towards the colonizers. Okay, in order to maintain kind of control over the colonies, they create gender categories. So not just racial categories, but gender categories to divide and conquer. So like Oyewumi, Gunn Allen is interested in the collaboration between some Indian men and whites in undermining the power of women. It is important for us to think about these collaborations as we think of the question of indifference to the struggles of women in racialized communities against multiple forms of violence against them and the communities. The white colonizer constructed a powerful inside force as colonized men were co-opted into patriarchal roles. Okay. So I think that this is important to understand is that coloniality, right? Coloniality of power, so is to create a system that justifies colonial control. And this knowledge system has to be based on certain values, right? So that, something is always considered better than the other. One thing is considered weak, one thing is considered strong. One group, one category is considered high, one category is considered low. You need to enforce this kind of value system in order to maintain a sort of system for the distribution of goods, resources, of labor, okay? So starting with Quijano argues that race is the first kind of category, right? So it's like, if white is good, then everything else is bad. And so then that justifies this sort of power system. So obviously white labor would be worth more than, colored labor, for example, okay? However, Lugones is arguing is that, no, it's not just race, but it's gender. And gender is intrinsic to colonial rule because the kind of gender differences are necessary in order to create this kind of system of power that justifies colonial rule. And specifically, it was used to undermine women and create these kinds of communities where where these kind of systems that they had before were disrupted. And part of the way that it was disrupted was by instituting a difference within indigenous groups by saying that gender is a big, important factor. By making it an important factor, then it creates the better possibility of organizing and dividing, okay? I think a really good example would be like, let's say, we had a system in place in the classroom, and it was like, the teachers versus the students, and I'm the teacher, right? And you're the students, right? So let's say the students, there's quite a bit of you, right? And so like, normally I would be like, okay, well, I'm the teacher, you should listen to what I say, but then maybe you might rise up, be like, no, there's more of us students and we're more powerful, we don't have to listen to you, we can do what we want, right? But let's say I start whispering to some of the students, be like, hey, hey student, you may not be a teacher, but at least you're a male student, and I'm a male teacher. So male students are better off than female students, right? And so if I start telling, the males, or creating this category of male inside the student group and telling these male groups or men, the masculine, okay, telling this group that they, are actually more powerful than the other students in their group, right? The feminine students, then they are incentivized to believe in this system of organization, even though overall it might diminish, their power as students. Okay, so it can be seen as a sort of tactic, I guess, but really, no, not a tactic, a strategy for instituting power and control. I don't know. You could see that as when teachers say you're an A student, you're a B student, and you're a C student. I don't know. Okay, but that's just kind of how power works. Power works through organization. Okay, and the creation of kind of categories of knowledge. Okay, all right. So let's go on. So this is quite obvious and it's quite obvious that this gender separation is not something that is separable from colonialism, according to Lugones. Okay, so and the reason is that because white women are not treated the same as women of color or colonized women. Okay, so to be a racialized woman is very different from being a non-racialized woman. And this is an example of the link and the intersectionality, okay, of the way that we think about gender has been intrinsically linked to colonialism itself. Okay, so that's very important to understand. All right, so I kind of want to keep going. So Lugones is making a critique of this kind of white bourgeois feminism. Okay, so she says, white feminist struggle became one against the positions, roles, stereotypes, traits, desires imposed on white bourgeois women's subordination. No one else's gender oppression was countenanced. They understood women as inhabiting white bodies, but did not bring that racial qualification to articulation or clear awareness. A really good example of this is Sojourner Truth, who was an abolitionist, and she went to a big conference of feminists who were fighting for the vote during the period of slavery, and she went there and she said, "Ain't I a woman?" Right? So aren't I also a woman? So the fact that she's a slave means that means that women are being subordinated as slaves. So why aren't feminists also fighting for the freedom and the abolition of slavery? Okay, so that's a very important, obvious example, right? So going on, Lugones says they, as in white bourgeois feminists, did not understand themselves in intersectional terms, at the intersection of race, gender, and other forceful marks of subjection or domination. Because they did not perceive these deep differences, they did not see a need for creating coalitions. They presumed a sisterhood, a bond given without the subjection of gender. So this is quite similar to thinking about how colonized men will undermine colonized women, right? Well, what is it about women who will undermine colonized women, okay, or raced women, okay? So this kind of gets to Lugones' key point, is that this is why you have disruptions and things where you might consider to be solidarity. Okay. So what are the criticisms of Lugones' theory? Okay, one is it definitely well, I don't know if it definitely. I'm not an anthropologist. Okay, but there's arguments that it idealizes pre-colonial societies. It makes it seem as though there was no patriarchies, before the colonizer came in. Okay. Also, that there's some limited evidence of gynocratic and non-heterosexually organized societies. So, the citations that Lugones uses, the research that Lugones uses, like of the Yoruba people, for example, is kind of limited, especially because the Yoruba people now apparently are very, very many are Muslim or Christian and very heterosexual and patriarchal. I mean, depending. Okay, so really, there's arguments about the scholarship. But nonetheless, the scholars that kind of disagree with Lugones or criticize the theory, they criticize it not in kind, like as a type, but really by degree. They're arguing that, yes, they still agree that colonialism exacerbated gendered hierarchies and heteronormativity by generating kind of drastic changes in social and cultural life for the indigenous and the colonized. I think that this is very similar to arguments that people make, about caste in India, or what was, and remember, India was not called India before the British came in, so let's just say, pre-colonial South Asia, okay, or religious differences. It's not that, there weren't religious differences or caste or racial differences before colonialism. It's that colonialism enforced these differences as a way to kind of control and organize. Okay, and so it exacerbated the importance of these differences, especially because these differences became means of access to resources, right? So even though Lugones is, even though there might not be much, and it's very hard to prove what life was like before colonialism, okay? Or if there, like in the case that we're talking about, like Hong Kong, like how can you conceive of Hong Kong pre-colonially, okay? At the same time, it's very important to understand that colonialism exacerbates and generates and makes these categories very, very important to social life, okay? Especially because capitalism is dependent upon these categories in order to run, okay? So, and that's another thing that, feminists and women of color feminist scholars will argue, is that you can't think about capitalism without thinking about patriarchy and without thinking about sexism. Because these categories are very important to the way that capitalism works, right? We can talk more about that in the forums if you like. Okay, so just mention it and we'll discuss more. Okay, so here are discussion questions, right? So if you would like to address these in the forums, feel free, okay? So how is what Lugones is arguing about the coloniality of gender different from what Simone de Beauvoir's theory of the second sex, okay? So remember Simone de Beauvoir, second wave feminist, talks about how one is not born but rather becomes a woman, right? So it was a critique of essentialism. Saying that basically there's no such thing as essentially a woman, that being a woman is something that's socialized and learned. It's an experience, okay? So as an existentialist, Beauvoir's arguing that this category of woman is one that, comes about through experience and existence, not one that is essentially, there's such thing as a woman, like as a category, a naturalized category. Okay, and then how is that different from Judith Butler's argument about the social construction of gender? So, I provided you the readings, but also as a reference reading, but also consider listening to the podcast. I think it's really good. But Butler argues that gender is a fundamental part not only of of how we identify people as people. So you can't think of a person without thinking of a person as gendered. So Butler is arguing that kind of even our understanding of people, what people are, and our knowledge, of creating a subject is gendered already. Okay, so her critique goes down to epistemology, right? This kind of theory of knowledge, right? That gender is one of those kind of fundamental ways of understanding what people are, and it goes all the way down to that sort of level, right? So Lugones' theory of coloniality of gender is that the kind of construction of gender is instituted by coloniality. Okay, whereas Butler is arguing that the institution of gender is instituted by kind of knowledge systems about what makes people people, okay, or a subject, and that it's already gendered already. So why do these differences matter? I think that this is the key question. Okay, why does it matter to think about that? Even though all three of these are demonstrating ways that gender is constructed, why is it important to understand gender as constructed in one way versus another, as linked to, for example, colonialism, or as linked to essentialism, or linked to epistemology? Okay. Lastly, how does Lugones' theory of the coloniality of gender apply to a place like Hong Kong, China, and Asia, which is not entirely colonial, which is not entirely not colonial? Okay. Is it applicable? Is it useful? And what does the fact that you have different systems, and yet still have gender differences in places like Hong Kong and China, and places in Asia, and yet at the same time, we're not colonized in the way that places in South America. And how does that undermine her theory? Does it apply? Do we need a different theory? Do you have any kind of speculation to think about it? All right. Okay, so that's our discussion questions, and I'll talk to you in the forums, and hopefully, we come up with some interesting kind of discussion. Okay, so that's it for this week's lecture. Like I said before, next week on the 27th, right? 27th. Okay. February 27th. We have a guest lecture and discussion with Dr. Nazri Barawi, so I really hope that you can make it. I know that classes are canceled and many of you have plans or whatever, and that's okay. But if you can, please try to join our conference, okay? And do the readings so that we're prepared to discuss this idea of, is decolonization really a metaphor or is it not a metaphor? And why does it matter? Okay? All right, so talk to you soon, and stay safe, stay healthy, wash your hands. Okay, bye.